When people talk about Yogi Berra, they usually talk about two things. They talk about the rings, all 10 of them, weighing down his hands. And they talk about the quotes, those funny little Yogi-isms that didn't make much sense until you really thought about them. But me, I saw a completely different side of the man. I wasn't a famous manager, and I wasn't a hotshot sports reporter. I was just the clubhouse manager for the New York Yankees. My job was incredibly simple. I folded the jerseys, shined the cleats, and cleaned up the locker room long after the crowds went home. And when you spend decades in that clubhouse, quietly working in the background, you notice things. You notice exactly who a guy like Yogi talks to when the cameras are turned off. You see who he trusts, who makes him laugh, and who he fiercely protects. If you want to know what made Yogi a legend on the field, you can just look up his records in the history books. But if you want to know the 5 teammates Yogi Berra truly loved the most, you have to ask the guy who was doing his laundry. The very first guy that always comes to mind when I think about Yogi's inner circle is Whitey Ford. If you spent even 5 minutes around the Yankees back in those golden days, you knew about Yogi and Whitey. They were practically joined at the hip, both on and off the field. As a clubhouse manager, I saw dozens of talented pitchers come and go through those swinging doors. And let me tell you a little secret about this game. Pitchers usually have massive, fragile egos. They are out there on an island, and they almost always think they know better than the guy crouching behind the plate. But Whitey wasn't like that at all, especially not when Yogi was putting down the signs. The level of absolute trust Whitey had in him was legitimately supernatural. I used to watch them sitting together in front of their lockers before a massive World Series game. The pressure in New York was always suffocating, enough to crack an ordinary man. But those two would just sit there, drinking a coffee, going over the opposing lineup with complete calm. They barely even needed to speak in full sentences to understand each other. Yogi would just grunt or nod his head a certain way, and Whitey would instantly know the entire game plan. Out on the mound, under the blinding lights of Yankee Stadium, that unspoken bond was a deadly weapon. A lot of famous pitchers love to dramatically shake off their catchers just to show the crowd who is really in charge. But Whitey almost never shook Yogi off. If Yogi put down one finger for a fastball high and tight, Whitey threw it with total conviction. He knew perfectly well that Yogi was constantly reading the batter's feet, studying their shoulders, and picking up on tiny flaws that nobody else saw. After a grueling high-stakes victory, they would come back into the locker room completely drained. While I was walking around picking up dirty towels and muddy cleats, I'd see Whitey walk straight over to Yogi's stall. He would just pat him softly on the shoulder and sit quietly next to him. There was no boasting, no loud celebrations. It was just a silent, powerful acknowledgement between two master craftsmen who had just dismantled another team. Yogi loved Whitey simply because Whitey gave him the ultimate respect of letting him run the entire game. In a sport where everyone desperately wants the spotlight, finding a superstar pitcher who completely surrenders his ego to his catcher is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. That rare, unbreakable trust built a genuine brotherhood that lasted until their very last days. Phil Rizzuto. When you play baseball in New York, the pressure is constantly breathing down your neck. You desperately need someone in the clubhouse who can break that suffocating tension. For Yogi, that guy was always Phil Rizzuto. Most people just called him Scooter. If you looked at them side by side, Phil and Yogi were the ultimate odd couple of baseball. Yogi was quiet, built like a fire hydrant, and rarely let his nerves show. Phil, on the other hand, was small, incredibly loud, and constantly worrying about every little detail. But despite those differences, they were absolute best friends. I used to watch them bickering like an old married couple right in the middle of the locker room. Phil would be pacing back and forth, frantically complaining about a broken superstition or a terrible call by the umpire. And Yogi would just sit there, slowly taping his wrists, and calmly drop a one-liner that would make the entire room burst into laughter. Baseball is a brutal game of failure, and it can easily eat you alive if you don't have a release valve. Phil was Yogi's ultimate release valve. Their friendship went way beyond the foul lines of Yankee Stadium. They actually opened a bowling alley together. They carpooled to the ballpark, and they constantly played practical jokes on each other. I remember days when Yogi was in a terrible slump, sitting silently at his locker, feeling the weight of the world. Phil would walk over, say something completely ridiculous, and instantly break the ice. Yogi loved Phil because Phil never let the game become too serious or too dark. He brought a sense of pure, unfiltered joy to a clubhouse that was expected to win the World Series every single year. You need a guy like that to survive the long, grueling months of a championship season without losing your mind. Even decades later, long after they both hung up their pinstripes, Yogi's face would still light up the second he heard Phil's voice in the room. That kind of friendship is just as rare as a perfect game. Mickey Mantle. Then there was the golden boy of New York, Mickey Mantle. If Phil brought the comedy to the locker room, Mickey brought the raw, unbelievable star power. To the fans up in the bleachers, Mickey looked like a Greek god who could do absolutely no wrong. But from my spot in the clubhouse, I saw a completely different reality. I saw a young kid who was essentially asked to replace the great Joe DiMaggio, carrying the weight of the entire world on a pair of completely shattered knees. The physical pain that Mickey endured on a daily basis was something most people couldn't even comprehend. And on top of that, the New York media was absolutely merciless back then, constantly looking for a reason to tear him down. That is exactly where Yogi stepped in. Yogi was already an established, highly respected veteran by the time Mickey really became the face of the franchise. Instead of being jealous of all the flashbulbs and magazine covers, Yogi became a fiercely protective older brother. Whenever the reporters would swarm Mickey's locker after a heartbreaking loss, throwing aggressive questions at him, Yogi would quietly wander over. He would casually drop one of his famous, deeply confusing quotes, completely derailing the journalists and taking the heat right off Mickey's back. It was a brilliant strategy, and he did it entirely to shield the kid. Mickey was a guy who demanded loyalty, mostly because he had so few people he could genuinely trust. There were hot summer days when Mickey could barely stand up to put on his own uniform. Yogi would just look at him from across the room, give him a subtle, reassuring nod, and then go out there and handle the pitching staff to make the game just a little bit easier for everyone. Mickey never ever forgot that kind of silent, unwavering protection. He idolized Yogi not just as a Hall of Fame catcher, but as the steady rock that kept the entire Yankees machine from crumbling under its own massive expectations. Yogi loved Mickey deeply because he saw the vulnerable, incredibly hard-working country boy hiding underneath the heavy cape of a New York superstar. They shared a brotherhood built on surviving the brightest, most blinding spotlight in all of professional sports, Joe DiMaggio. Now, if you want to talk about how Yogi learned to be a true professional, you absolutely have to talk about Joe DiMaggio. When Yogi first came up to the big leagues back in 1946, he was pretty rough around the edges. He didn't exactly look like your classic athletic ball player, and a lot of people in the press doubted if he even belonged in pinstripes, but Joe was already the undisputed king of New York. He was the ultimate symbol of grace, quiet intensity, and absolute perfection on the baseball field. As the guy taking care of the clubhouse, I always kept a close eye on Joe. I remember watching him get ready before those high-stakes afternoon games. It was legitimately like watching a priest prepare for a Sunday mass. He would put on his uniform with this slow, meticulous precision, making sure every button and every seam was perfectly in place. He rarely ever spoke. Yogi used to sit a few lockers down, just staring at him in complete and utter awe. He absorbed every single detail of how Joe carried himself, both in victory and in defeat. Joe didn't need to give loud, fiery motivational speeches to lead the team. His sheer presence alone demanded absolute excellence from every single man in that room. For a young, unpolished kid like Yogi, Joe was the ultimate gold standard. Joe silently taught him that wearing the New York Yankee pinstripes meant you never showed the opponent you were hurt. It meant you never let the immense pressure of the city break your focus. Even though Joe was an untouchable, larger-than-life superstar, he saw something incredibly special in Yogi's raw talent. He took the kid under his wing, not with long lectures, but strictly by his daily example. When Joe eventually retired and walked away from the game, it was Yogi who naturally stepped up to become the steady leader of the clubhouse. He took all that quiet dignity he learned from Joe DiMaggio and passed it right down to the next generation of players. Yogi deeply loved Joe because Joe showed him exactly what it meant to be a true champion. He didn't just teach him how to play the game of baseball, he taught him how to respect it. Don Larsen. Now, the last name on this list is tied to a single unforgettable afternoon. If you know anything about the history of the New York Yankees, you already know about Don Larsen. When you talk about the connection between a pitcher and a catcher, October 8th, 1956, is the ultimate masterpiece. It was Game 5 of the World Series, and the tension in the stadium was absolutely suffocating. I was standing right in the tunnel, watching every single inning unfold. Pitching a perfect game in the regular season is almost impossible. Doing it in the World Series, with the entire world watching your every move, is something that shouldn't even be humanly possible. But Don did it, and Yogi was the one steering the ship through the storm. He called every single pitch of that game, guiding Don through the most high-pressure situations imaginable. Don never questioned a single sign that Yogi put down. He just nodded, wound up, and threw exactly what Yogi asked for. When that final out was called, something incredible happened. Yogi wasn't a guy who usually showed wild, uncontrollable emotion on the baseball field. But the second the umpire punched the air, Yogi sprinted out from behind home plate and launched himself right into Don Larsen's arms. That picture is probably the most famous photograph in the entire history of baseball. But from my perspective in the clubhouse, it wasn't just a standard celebration of a championship. It was an explosion of pure, profound gratitude. Yogi knew exactly how incredibly hard it was to do what Don had just done. He loved Don because Don trusted him enough to achieve absolute perfection on the biggest stage in the sport. Every year, when the anniversary of that perfect game came around, you could see the deep, unspoken bond they still shared. It was a brotherhood forged in a moment of pure, undeniable magic. When I walk through Monument Park now, I see all those bronze plaques and retired numbers. People come from all over the world just to look at the incredible legacy of the New York Yankees. They stare at Yogi's name and they think about the 10 World Series rings, the MVP awards, and all those famous quotes. But standing there, I always think about something entirely different. I think about the quiet trust of Whitey Ford. I think about the echoing laughter of Phil Rizzuto. I remember the fierce, protective loyalty to Mickey Mantle. I remember the profound, silent respect for Joe DiMaggio. And I can still clearly see that joyful leap into the arms of Don Larsen. Because at the end of the day, the championship trophies eventually just gather dust in a museum. The box scores fade away in the archives of old newspapers. The real legacy of Yogi Berra wasn't just how masterfully he played the game of baseball. It was how deeply he loved the men who played it right alongside him. That is the story of Yogi, from the guy who folded his jerseys. But now I genuinely want to hear from all of you. If you had to choose the most beloved and respected players in the history of this great game, who would make your list? Let me know down in the comments below.